Hello, good day everybody. I guess it's no longer morning, almost afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak and moderate this panel because since I've started working at the University of Rijeka in 2008, really I've been pushing through my projects and cooperation precisely what this interdisciplinary studies want to achieve. And I think it's very easy to be ambitious and come up with a concept, but the much harder work is actually putting it into practice. I think that's the challenge that we'll have here today, and that was one of the reasons why some of the speakers I've also invited to come on this panel is to give us a critical voice in that. And I think there's a lot of competition out there, and why would people want to come to this university or come to this program? And I think that's what we have to think about in the way we conceptualize it. And a lot of the programs I've also worked on, is it European, is it Mediterranean, is it Southeastern Europe? Is it globalized studies? How do we really frame this, and what makes us competitive and interesting compared to the other products that are out there? And I think this is an opportunity for the University of Rijeka to raise its international profile, to bring international students, to have more cooperation. And I think another important element, which hopefully our guests will also bring up, is the synergy between the university and the city. And there's a lot of exciting things going on in Rijeka. We've seen in one of the earlier presentations some of what the city has to offer. And I come from a city in Seattle where the city also had gone through tough times with the Boeing air industry falling apart, and what was the engine that moved forward? It was investment in higher education. So the University of Washington was one of these motors for development. I think we can also think about that. How does the university development and the program affect the growth of the city? And so who is our student target audience? What do we want of them? So I think we really have to think quite critically and quite detailed what we want and how we want to promote this European interdisciplinary studies. And maybe a sort of a personal interest reason is I think we should also keep our students here. There's so many of the students leaving Croatia, and I think we have a lot to offer. And I think Rijeka, with its location and its history and the professors and programs we have here, really can help this develop. So I think I'll, with that brief intro, begin inviting our three presenters and one discussant. So our first panelist will be Hans Åke Persson from the University of Roskilde in Denmark. And I should also say, in addition to the scholars on this panel who are all excellent researchers, they're all involved in programs that are interdisciplinary and involving cooperation over borders and so on. I'll invite all the three panelists up first as well. And also the opportunity to be at their universities, to see them in action. So I think we really have a treat today to hear their experience. The second panelist is Christopher Lamont from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And finally, Joe Shaw from University of Edinburgh, the law school. And our one discussant is Nenad Miščević. The dean, unfortunately, has expressed he's apologized because he has a summit to attend to, so he will not be joining us this afternoon. I'll just give a brief also background. Hans Åke, who, as I mentioned, is working in Denmark, but has also been influential in the development of Malmö, which is a city in southern Sweden, and has also experienced this regional development, and from economic problems has built quite a successful and redesigned the city. And I think when we spent time in Sweden last year and talking about how Rijeka can also transform, what is the way out of the current situation? Is it culture? Is it reinvestment in technology, industry? And I think what they've done in the Scandinavian countries can serve as an interesting model for us. With Chris, we go way back. We were both Fulbright students in Croatia. We've worked on organizing a number of conferences, roundtables, lecture exchanges. working on Mediterranean issues. We even have a summer school now. Hopefully we'll have our third annual summer school this year on transitional justice and the politics of memory. So this is maybe Chris will talk a little bit more in detail about that. And he's an assistant professor in international relations, but does a lot of things. Also is on the co-chair of ethics and globalization studies. He lectures in Japan. He spends a lot of time in North Africa, worked in Tunis on transitional justice issues, so he's travels even more than I do, which is kind of hard to believe. But so it'd be interesting to hear what Groningen does in their globalization program and their idea of consortiums and a lot of interesting things. Here's a university that is reaching out and has a lot of these programs that perhaps we could also learn from. And our third panelist, Jo Shaw, in the law school, but also she holds the Slavinson Chair of European Institutions and is the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. Also worked on CITSI, which is on citizenship in Southeastern Europe, and has brought together an amazing group of young scholars, really, really sharp. I had a chance to be at their final conference last year and was blown away by the quality of bringing students, many of them from the former Yugoslavia, Southeastern Europe, but from other parts of the world as well, and taking education and making it relevant also to the questions of the referendum that just took place there, if we're talking about citizenship and the experience of the former Yugoslavia. So, without further ado, I'll give it to our first panelist, HP, as his colleagues like to call him. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I don't know these words, but if I give it to you, on the screen.
Okay, we've turned it on, and now we've got the arrows. And if you want the laser, so just the arrows left, right.
Too much. There we go. Well, thank you for inviting me. We were supposed to be two persons. Myself, here, and my colleague, who was interesting in many ways, because he was one of the chief designers of changing Malmö into a city of knowledge, from a city with shipyards, blue colors, and a lot of problems, into a city of knowledge. And that has been very successful in 15 years. I'm part from, first of all, I'm from Lund University, professor of history in Roskilde. First Lund University, then Malmö University, and now I am in Roskilde. So I've made a tour over the troubled waters as it once were in the Öresund area. Christer Persson couldn't come because of the flu, and his wife told him that he couldn't stay at home because he was too sick. So I will start with talk about the political circumstances when we started with European studies. That's the first part of my speech. The second part of my speech will be more academic, pro and contra in a way. Then I will be more effective by checking into the notes on the conversations we had when we started European studies in the 90s. So, maybe I have to use you.
Sorry, no, didn't.
Just, yeah, you can stand there.
I can, but that's. This is easier, you have more power this way.
I want to show you where I am from which city, and also the. No, it's not easy. Hey. It's only 5 or 6. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, what you see here is the southern part of Sweden, which is Skåne, on the right side. And on the other side, you have Sila, the eastern parts of Denmark. And if you want to see the name Sila, I noticed yesterday when I was walking around here, you can go down to the harbor and you will see the name Zeeland all over the place because of the transportation of the big Danish company. In 1999, we got a bridge between these two countries and England. And that meant that we could transport people a lot more. And the next 15 years, there was a great change with the migration between these two parts. This area was also established a European region area, which meant that we were in for a lot of money from Brussels. So I don't know if you know about the bridge, but you can see the bridge to the right there. And I can also maybe say something about that because I don't know if you have reflected that Copenhagen is in the periphery of the kingdom, the Danish kingdom. And the reason for that is actually that it is from a historical perspective, that part where I am from is actually the eastern part of former Denmark. The Danes lost this area in 1658. They tried 1678 to get it back, but it didn't. They lost 7,000 people outside my hometown, where there's a monument is back. And now, but we have been living in peace since then, but there's a big difference between these two countries. So, this is the next one. Well, I don't know if you've seen you have? Yeah, it's called the tunnel, and maybe you know that more than the bridge per se. So, next one, please. That's to the well, in the beginning there was a lot of enthusiasm. In a way, there still are, but not that much at all, as it once was. We're going to have a conference in January where we discuss why the integration was halted. Öresund University was established in the beginning and the end of the 20th century and lasted for, I think it was 10 years. And there were about 14 collaborating universities in this establishment. There were about 125,000 students and 14,000 researchers. So it was actually a huge university. But it wasn't a university in the normal sense. It was more a web address. But it lasted, as I said, for 10 years, and we could use that concept to get more money from Brussels. So at that time, we sat down and tried to find out in what way can we cooperate over the border and create a real trans-regional region. And we got some money to find out how many European studies were, how were they constructed, and we saw by the vice rector earlier the different ways of doing that. And out of that came the suggestion to establish the European studies over the waters. Another way, if you want to see and want to buy the idea of the European studies, you can go to the EU Studies Fair in Brussels. There you will find, I don't know if you've been there, but there is people selling their European studies in law, in economics, in politicals, from all over the world. It is normally in February, and you can actually, so we went down there just to see what are they offering. And that is actually an interesting fair, and it still continues. So the European studies is on the market, so to say. One reflection many years later is, of course, in the 1990s we had European studies. Being a historian, there is a context, there's a historical context, there's a change over time, and European studies then has now become global studies, or European studies with a global perspective. Please, next one. Well, I couldn't help. I don't know if I'm doing something. No, that's fine. We are in a way in a nationalization project, if EU can be called. And then I remember the Swedish Nobel Prize winner, Nils Selman Lagerlöf. I don't think you know about it. His book came out, you do, 1906. And Nils Holgersson she wrote that in the nationalization part. Okay, thank you for that. So I just put it on, and then we take the next one, because maybe we are there now, some kind of a, I don't know, nationalization project when it comes to Europe per se. So, and this is House of European History that is going to be established in 2015. That is a real, well, it's a project that could be discussed. And then the next one is, so I will now look more firmly on our notes from when we started the European Studies per se. And of course, the discussion, what is Europe? That's not unique. What does a European identity mean? These are fundamental questions in the study of Europe. They should be constantly asked from various angles without necessarily receiving any unambiguous answers. The starting point for my approach is the humanities, the study of history and culture, with a heavy emphasis on a critical attitude to current politics and societal conditions and trends. In the case of European studies, this means, for example, a critical stance on the project of the European Union and on the renewed nationalism that is presented as an alternative to the bureaucracy in Brussels. An important feature of this humanistic approach is the application of a deep historical perspective on the present. This places our own times and our zeitgeist in a broader context and can therefore help to relativize the absolute claims that are made nowadays. This allows us to see that Europe has meant very different things to different people in the different parts of Europe and at different times in its history. That the nations we often regard as absolute in our narrow contemporary perspective are the products of chance and processes of historical change. To take two examples of important insights that can be gained. Such a perspective increases the focus on questions about how norms, values, identities are created and formed, and how they affect political culture, societal organizations, and institutions. This is a general starting point from the perspective of the human sciences. But what are the characteristics of European studies in more concrete terms? To begin with, what premises does the subject of European studies build on as regards the theory of science? If we look at practice, we see that this is definitely an open question. European studies is in many cases based on a more or less unreflected notion of Europe and an unorganized, multidisciplinary approach. A few different subjects are brought together on the theme of Europe and together allowed to constitute European studies. The study is also quite often epicentric in an unreflected way, with the student's own nation state as a given point from which to observe Europe as an external phenomenon. When taken an intellectual stance on the subject designation European studies, the question of the scholarly legitimacy and the status of the subject in terms of theory of science immediately becomes acute. European studies is obviously not a discipline of the traditional kind, with its own theories, its own methods, its typical forms of source material. In short, European studies is not an epistemological defined discipline, such as traditional disciplines, political science, law, history, sociology, economics. European studies is not a discipline of this kind. Unlike traditional disciplines, it's quite simply not defined in terms of the regulated and uniform way in which one attains knowledge. It seems more obvious to define European studies ontological, or external, or open, if you prefer. That is in terms of the object of study. This is how area studies are usually defined, and it is of course natural to regard European studies as area studies. The difficulty with viewing European studies in this way on the other hand, is that it does not solve the problem of the theoretical status of the subject. For Europe is a notoriously elusive and mutable phenomenon, changing like a chameleon through history and depending on the observer's geographical, cultural, social, gender-related and political standpoint. If the object of study is supposed to carry the subject, it is unfortunate if this study object is so unstable. Defining European studies as EU studies may even be one way out of this dilemma, in that it would create a somewhat more stable study object. There are, however, several problems with an orientation towards EU studies, some of which we shall look at in more detail below. But above all, for many people this choice is far too narrow a framework in which to pursue European studies. It is of course necessary to study the EU at a time when the development of the European Union is becoming increasingly significant for individual countries and individuals alike, so we still do it. Yet the EU is perceived here mostly as a collection of institutions, treaty texts, and regulatory systems which are little more than an extension of the nation-state reality that is studied in the disciplines of political science and law. Europe is, of course, much more comprehensive and difficult to define than this. Maybe that point is a bit narrow-minded, but for the purpose of the discussion, let us leave it at that. We are then forced to search for the stability somewhere other than in the study of it. A kind of return to an epistemological strategy has been proposed, to bring in historical sociology as the theoretical and methodological backbone of the subject. A solution of this kind would ground European studies in the historical, processual, and structural study of European society, its institution and forms of organization, its culture and community. This is in many ways an attractive solution. It brings together social science and humanities in a concerted approach to the object of study, Europe. The study object can now be defined in a stable but simultaneously open way, in that the processes and structures, the institution and forms of organization that are studied will prove to be only partly overlapping and with ramifications far beyond the European core. Particularly with the globalization of European society starting in the 16th century, the study of Europe will also be situated in a global context. Well, despite its advantages, the choice of historical sociology as a foundation for European studies has some serious disadvantages. At least if we look at the whole from the critical humanistic standpoint proclaimed above. One important disadvantage is that the concerted approach of historical sociology tends towards a deterministic view of historical development. Historical sociologists work with a conceptual apparatus that is centered on the present, where the state is the completely dominant constant. There is, of course, a risk that they see states where there are none, and even more importantly, they do not see a lot of other interesting things since they are only looking for states. To simplify something, the task to be carried out is to sort and order the jumble of historical phenomena with the aid of the conceptual apparatus of historical sociology, and to draw the historical lines leading to the goal, our times and our society. One consequence of this is that the description of the world through time by historical sociology tends towards a historical overdetermination of our times and the immediate future. The lines of development that are described in history acquire such weight and directions that they narrow the forward field of vision. What happens, if you like, is a reduction of the perceived expectations. To put it in a postmodern terminology, historical sociology quite simply tends to construct a grand narrative about Europe, a narrative with an internal logic and coherence that links history and the future in a particular uniform way, and thereby restricts the perception of what can be done today. In contrast, the critical humanistic approach seeks to problematize and deconstruct these grand narratives about Europe, or about the nation for that matter, in order to give scope for the multitude of narratives and outlooks. The aim is to widen the expectation horizon. Another way forward is to retain the ontological strategy, that is to stick to Europe as an object of study, but simultaneously to benefit from the potential of area studies, the openness of the epistemological field, the multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary terms. Yet the problem of the unstable object of study then returns. But is it a real problem? It is, strictly speaking, a problem common to area studies as such, which has not prevented the scientific genre from flourishing. If such a study is grounded in the approach of the human sciences declared above, the instability of the study object may actually seem like an advantage. Every field of knowledge that is defined ontologically naturally tends to contribute to the objectification of its field of study. This is particularly true if there is an active endeavor to give the object in question a stable definition, an endeavor which actually seems to go against the preferred critical humanistic. The way hitherto most frequently used to give European studies a reasonable, stable study, the choice of the EU, may exemplify the problem. The objectification and determinism that are described in the case of the historical sociology above may be seen in another more pronounced form in the ideologization of European studies, which risks arising if one defines the object of study as ECEU. European studies of the EU type, most frequently, tends to contribute to the construction of a grand narrative on Europe, to give the concept of Europe a more or less definite meaning, and above all, to give Europe a clear demarcation line. Yet, a grand narrative like this, that is chiefly based on a relatively narrow experience of an elitist economic and bureaucratic integration in certain parts of Western Europe during a few decades in the second half of the 20th century, has its limitations. The internal coherence and plot of the narrative does not exactly seem to include Eastern Europe, since the latter is more or less absent from the narrative. The role of Eastern Europe in this narrative on Europe is mostly that of a feeling which to pursue a kind of Western European inner colonialism. To take just one example, on the scholarly level, an ideological color limitation like this can be devastating, and is directly in conflict with the efforts of critical humanism to promote diversity of experiences and output, and to broaden the expectation horizon. A historical parallel to this kind of trend in European studies can be found in the alliance between the state and common scholarship in the construction of the nation state, also referred as methodological nationalism. The majority of our modern humanistic and social science disciplines were established in symbiosis with the nation state, and the result in practice was a kind of nation-state studies with the nation and the people as guiding categories, and with nationalism as ideology subjects such as history, technology, economics, and political science help to order. I'm soon, 3 minutes. See world in terms of nations, peoples, and nation states. Nation-state studies is a particular organization of the production of knowledge that it has worked well for a long time. But at the 21st century, structural transformations and societal processes have weakened the political, economic, and cultural hegemony of the nation state. The result is that several of the traditional human and social sciences have begun to find it increasingly difficult to handle the change. At first glance, European studies should be better equipped for the challenges, particularly since the growth of united Europe is an important part of the changes that threaten the nation state. Yet, the end of the Cold War helped to lead the transformation processes in part in new directions. a development that does not entirely suit the traditional form of European studies as EU studies. In the 90s, the European project found itself in several difficulties. The disappearance of Iron Curtain is especially important in this connection. It meant that the European integration project lost one important lesson, that the struggle against communism and the sense of European community that had been built into the Western European thinking in the post-war years lost it till the distinct Eastern Bloc. Well, in the light of all this, it seems possible to argue that the definition and demarcations of the field of study should be kept open. If one proceeds from a critical humanism, this might even appear self-evident. Europe is historically and culturally programmed concept which has undergone numerous transformations and which is given different meanings from different standpoints. At the same time, it sums up a complex societal and cultural reality. The complexity and mutability that are thereby conceptualized in the term Europe are preferably from a critical humanistic perspective to the search for an ambiguously defined Europe. This is the purpose of giving European studies the form of humanistically based area studies. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those some provocative comments. And next, Chris Lamont.
All right, thank you, Geron. And first of all, I'd like to start with thanking the organizers for having invited me here to the University of Rijeka. It's really exciting to see the launch of a new Center for Advanced Studies and to see a lot of the programs that Rijeka is offering. And Geron invited me here and he asked me to talk a little bit about what we do at the University of Groningen. And as Geron has mentioned, we collaborate on a number of projects. But before I get started, I'll just say a little bit about myself and what I do at Groningen. Well, first and foremost, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of International Relations. And international relations at Groningen has a slightly different genealogy than IR programs elsewhere. And first of all, it emerged within a Department of History in the 1990s. And it grew as a section within that department and eventually ended up recruiting more staff than the history department itself, and then became its own department. So as today we have about 1,000 undergraduate students and a whole host of MA students pursuing MAs in international relations, which interestingly, kind of following on from the last presentation, are all thematically defined in the sense that there's a MA in international relations and international political economy, an MA in international relations and international security, and an MA in global governance. And there's only one that is geographically defined, but it is not European studies. There's also an MA in international relations with a focus on the Far East. And when we talk about universities and the impact that these interfaculty institutes can have, this looks like it's collapsing over there. But it was good to highlight one historic anecdote from Groningen before moving a little bit further along in this presentation. And since the ambassador from Japan is here, I thought I would mention that University of Groningen is a university that's 400 years old. But about 200 years ago, the University of Groningen, staff from the University of Groningen participated in opening up a medical school in Osaka. And that has resulted in long-standing ties between what became Osaka University and Groningen University, whereas there's an Osaka University Center today at the University of Groningen, and I also wear another hat within the university, at the University of Osaka as a specially appointed professor of transitional justice in the Osaka School for International Public Policy. And I go there in Januaries and Februaries and teach. But in relation to some of the concrete programs that we offer, most of the stuff we do with, for example, Geron and with international partners is through a center called Globalization Studies Groningen, which is, first of all, internally a interfaculty research institute. Now, in about 2011, people higher up within the university had an awareness, or got an awareness that there were a lot of people doing research on overlapping themes within various faculties, but because of the faculty structure of the university, there was very little communication. So for example, I work on transitional justice within the Department of International Relations, which is housed within the Faculty of Arts, and there are a number of colleagues who work on similar themes within the Faculty of Law. And this Interfaculty Research Institute created a forum in which researchers within the university could come together and collaborate and take up opportunities to develop international collaboration with various partners. And that's kind of the genesis of the summer school that Dieron mentioned, that we have at the university, with the University of Rijeka, and we hold on the island of Cres. And this was quite fascinating when it initially was started, because one of the things that highlighted to me was that Croatia is in a unique position, and the Center for Advanced Studies is in a unique position in that it can really emphasize its role and its place as a Mediterranean country. I mean, the slide of the port city and the cosmopolitanism of Rijeka is something that's well known elsewhere. Now, most of my field research, which I'm not going to talk about here, is in North Africa. So I spend a lot of time in countries like Tunisia and Libya and Egypt. And there's a significant amount of interest in Croatia's experience with transition in particular. In fact, 2 years ago, we had 4 Libyans at our summer school on transitional justice and the politics of memory. And one of the Libyans was a member of staff at the UN support mission in Libya. And he mentioned that coming to Croatia and hearing the experiences of Croatian NGO activists and Croatian academics was like for him being able to go into the future and travel 20 years into Libya's future. Because a lot of the things that are happening now in Libya, they're going to have to deal with the consequences of at a later date. And for him, this was absolutely fascinating. And likewise, with regards to other countries experiencing transition, the transitional experience of Croatia can help the Center for Advanced Studies perhaps serve as a hub more so than a university in Western Europe, such as the University of Groningen. And one of the things that we've done in Tunisia, one of the things you hear in Tunisia and North Africa a lot, is an appeal for greater international engagement with universities on the ground in countries in North Africa. And so we run a joint program with the University of Souss's Faculty of Law and Political Science, and we've done this for the past 3 years, in part with the generous support of the Dutch Embassy in Tunis. And this has proved, and this really started as a joint initiative between staff at the University of Sousse, who in the afterglow of the revolution said, well, we would like to offer a lot of new curricula that we now have the opportunity to do. And we have the opportunity to do this now, such as programs in, for example, human rights and transitional justice, but we don't really have the capacity to do that. And so we were invited in to offer programs for Tunisian students in transitional justice and human rights. And this became a quite successful summer program in which we now bring Dutch students to the University of Sousse to have class side by side with Tunisian students and discuss a number of contentious issues. The first of which was transitional justice in the summer of 2012. The year after, with the thematic focus was on human rights, and this past summer we focused on elections as Tunisia is preparing to hold its first parliamentary elections later on this week after having ratified its post-revolutionary constitution. So in this sense, the title of the panel is asking us, well, what is European studies and what kind of European studies are needed in Southeastern Europe and the Western Balkans? And drawing upon Hans' presentation, where you emphasize the need for kind of a broader definition of European studies, one can think, well, not just what kind of European studies is needed for Southeastern Europe, but what kind of European studies is needed by Europe's neighbors, however we might define them, such as countries experiencing transition, countries experiencing conflict that are right on the borders of Europe. And here, a center such as the Center for Advanced Studies has a tremendous opportunity to engage with countries in the northern Mediterranean, which would look to places like Rijeka, which would look to countries such as Croatia as natural partners to discuss these issues. And in a greater sense, a lot of the issues perhaps have greater resonance. So one of the things that we're doing in December is we're bringing students from the University of Sousse to Groningen for a special program on human rights, and we're also going to be looking at local democracy since after Tunisia's national elections this year, they'll be preparing for local elections next year. Now, the country was previously a highly centralized political system, and a lot of the grievances from the revolution are best dealt with at the local level. But there's a gap in capacity in terms of local democracy and local governance. And Groningen is an interesting destination for example, youth politicians who we've brought up to the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, because they can see local democracy in practice, right? We are very far from the capital of the Netherlands, about as far as you can get and still be in the Netherlands. So it's about 2.5 hours by train, or 3 hours to The Hague, depending on which train you catch. And I think likewise, Rijeka can use this regional, its status as a regional city to its advantage in engaging with universities that are outside of the capitals of their respective countries. So in short, what I found is fascinating is that on the one hand, there is a significant difference between what we do at Groningen and what we do, or what I've heard so far today, in the sense that the regional dimension is kind of left out of the definition of the Interfaculty Research Institute, but also the programs in international relations, which largely have a thematic focus. But the experience of the region, the experience of, particularly if we look at, instead of, for example, of Europe, we look at a map of Mediterranean Europe, provides a number of opportunities for the Center of Advanced Studies to develop programs which include programs that Björn and I hope to continue, and will continue this summer, the Summer School on Transitional Justice and the Politics of Memory, and to bring people from the Mediterranean region to Croatia to see firsthand the experiences of a country that has experienced in its past many of the challenges that these countries are experiencing now, and perhaps there could be a learning process, a bridge-building process between Croatia and countries on the other side of the Mediterranean. So it might seem like an odd thing for me to say, coming from the university kind of on the periphery of the north of the Netherlands, that the focus could be kind of, when you look at Europe, we could focus more on the Mediterranean. But nevertheless, my experience over the past few years tends to have highlighted that observation. So I think I will conclude with that.
Okay, great. So another perspective, and because I work with Chris so much, I mean, we've actually developed this spiel together. So it was actually like hearing some of my own thoughts in that. But I think it also gives some great ideas for how to move forward, both of these presentations. So I'm sure our third presenter will also give us some critical perspective on potential European studies.
Without knocking it over. Okay, is that sort of what is it? Yeah? Is the microphone seems a bit on anyway. Thank you very much for the invitation. Funnily enough, I received an email a few weeks ago telling me that the British Embassy very kindly agreed to pay my travel here. I don't think that what they bargained for paying for was a fuss from Zadar. I'm currently spending a month in Zadar on research visits, and I visited Zadar in the same trip along the Adriatic, our Adria trip that a colleague and I took in March of this year, when we also visited Rijeka, and I gave a lecture here. My colleague also gave a lecture here as well, and we visited a number of universities, Trieste, Pula, Rijeka, Zadar, and we also got down as far as Split, but that was largely really for personal reasons. And the touristic reasons. The point of the trip was really, in a sense, to sort of reimagine this westerly coast, and its different historic connections to Austro-Hungarian Empire to the former Yugoslavia and now also to the states to which it also which it now belongs to and is passed to Croatia as well, and to examine these issues about peripherality and regionalism, which you've already brought up. I'm really glad to be going after Christopher's presentation, also after Hans's presentation, because they've also already introduced so many really interesting ideas on which I can build. And this was part of my my CITSI project, the Citizenship in Southeast Europe project, which is just coming to an end right now, which is really why I'm in Zadar doing some writing up. And I've had the privilege of working with a whole variety of early career scholars from all of the different post-Yugoslav states and a number of other states who are themselves, as they're working on various aspects of issues, societal, political issues raised in Southeast Europe and in the Western Balkans and in the Europeanization context. And it has been an immense privilege. And you might ask, well, haven't you built up a centre of excellence there in Edinburgh, coming now to the institution where I work? But yes and no. Of course, we've developed certain competencies. But in terms of early career researchers, and this comes on to my second, if you will, my second hat that I'm wearing in this conference. In terms of early career competencies, I'm a great believer in mobility. So in reality, wherever you are in Europe, you're very unlikely to be very far away from a young CITSI researcher. They're all over the place. They will pop up all over the place. They're in the European University Institute with Joseph Weiler. They soon will be at the university. One of them will soon be at the University of Pula on a new FEL program, which is, I think, one of the very exciting mobility programs that's been made possible as part of the Europeanization process. And so I come with a second hat on, which is to encourage networks, networking, mobility, and that type of transition through cooperation between institutions such as this Centre of Excellence and my own Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities, which I recently took up the role of directing this centre, this institute within the University of Edinburgh that offers. It acts as a venue for scholars. We've been receiving now 1,000 scholars since 1969, and we also act as a laboratory for incubating new ideas right across the social sciences and humanities disciplines, bringing together both the expertise within the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Edinburgh and scholars from outside. And in that context, we are a part of the EURIAS network, which Sam referred to, and we're very pleased and proud to be associated with the Centre of Excellence in Rijeka and Southeast Europe in that context, and we hope to work with you further in the future. And then that sort of, in a sense, finally brings me to my third hat, which I'm wearing here, which is my own disciplinary hat, if you will. I'm trained as an EU lawyer, and I work at the University of Edinburgh, which likes to think of itself probably as one of the United Kingdom's most European universities. And I think that possibly can't be said so much about all of the universities in the UK at the moment, given the challenges which are based on the issue of Europeanisation, Europeanism in the context of the UK. And I was for some time the director of the Europa Institute, which is an interdisciplinary centre for study of European issues, European institutions, European politics and law and societies in my capacity as ordinary Salvesen chair. And that Europa Institute predates in its foundation the UK's membership of the European communities, or the common market as we like to call it then. So that leads me then to make some remarks about how we might envisage the role of the role of law within the context of interdisciplinary studies. As of course Snežna noted in her presentation, there are numerous specialist courses around that offer masters, law masters, LLMs, in MBAs, Magister Juris, in European law, in European Union law, in European legal studies, and my own School of Law in Edinburgh is one such European studies, European law masters, and in that context it's essentially a monodisciplinary enterprise, although individual courses may be run in a more interdisciplinary way. But you really are raising for yourselves through the interdisciplinary master's proposal the biggest challenge, which is to think about interdisciplinarity, not just juxtaposing the different disciplines, but bringing them to articulate against each other. And so in that context, the last thing that you're imagining for yourselves is to either have a law master's which is separate, or to have law then simply in an alternative position, which will be as a sort of service discipline. So imagine in that context, if you will, the sort of three obvious spheres within which law may be of relevance. Think about the international or the regional international sphere, where we might want students to know something about the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. We might want them to know more about how the Council of Europe operates. We might want them to know more about the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Venice Commission, and the way in which these all operate in the spheres of human rights and constitutionalism and the promotion of the rule of law. But we could imagine in that context then that there could be a risk, though, that law is simply then a service discipline. It provides a substratum of information, and that's surely, I think, not the challenge that you pose for yourself. In that context, perhaps thinking critically already, one of the questions that's raised by the sort of cultural dimension that was mentioned by Schneider in her presentation, I think is very much inherent as well in the discussions that we had just now from Hans and from Christopher, is the issue of cultural adaptation. Cultural adaptation is more than just changing rules, and in that context, perhaps the critical question that we might take from regional international law might be then the issue of margin of appreciation. How do states adapt their engagement with transnational norms on human rights and the rule of law in accordance with respect for those international norms as representing imminent standards, but at the same time adapting and recognizing the dimension of local adaptability, local adaptation, and the challenges that poses. I think then at the other level where law may come in as a service discipline, we might want people to learn more about the legal the institutions, and we want them to know not just that those institutions exist, but that certain processes that might be talked about rather loosely in the newspapers, for example, around the nomination, appointment, and election, depending on your terminology, of the President of the European Commission, are processes which have been negotiated through the treaties, and have been ratified by the member states, and have certain legal opportunities and legal constraints. And we would want our students to know about those things. We would want them to know that the customs union is an entity structured around law, and we would want them to know that the single market is also structured around law. But again, we wouldn't want them simply to treat law as a service discipline. And here perhaps critical questions are raised, so many that I couldn't even begin to enumerate them here, but do we think about European integration only, or do we also think about European disintegration? Or is somehow European integration is a legal project, European disintegration is a political project? So somehow these are separate rather than two things which are in dynamic conversation with each other. Here I'm simply raising some questions about how we might want our students to be thinking about questions in a more than just descriptive, technical manner. The question of domestic adaptation there is as well more than just one of practical adaptation, practical implementation, but very much one of legal cultural adaptation. I've done a lot of work in the area of legal cultural adaptation to the challenges of free movement of persons in recent years, and believe me, there's a tremendous amount of material there which raises all of those critical challenges that we were talking about earlier on. And then moving finally to the domestic sphere, and in a sense everything seems to be trickling down to the domestic sphere, but arguably perhaps everything is being uploaded from the domestic sphere. There is an argument that can be made that the national legal orders often predate the international, transnational or supranational legal orders, and that in fact, as EU lawyers are wont to say and to remind us, and national constitutional lawyers particularly keen to remind us that the masters or mistresses of the treaties in the European Union context are the member states. It's the member states who sign and ratify the treaties, but and then when it comes to legislation, the member states sitting in the Council of Ministers are very much the co-legislature with the European Parliament. So the national legal orders are not just something where EU law is being done to it, or international law is being done to it, but there are dynamic iterative relationships between these three levels that one needs to take into account. So how do we then get beyond the legal technical? We don't want the student simply to learn a bit of this and a bit of that, and not then acquire certain competencies to understand, and then to be able to build their own knowledge through being able to self-learn, to be self-developing professionals in whatever sphere they choose to work within, whether they go on to be academics or whether they go on to work within various spheres of practice, or NGOs, or government, or private sector, wherever that might be. And that is, of course, the area then where methodology is incredibly important, that students should have an understanding of what it is that animates research questions in the fields that they are studying. In other words, how, if they were to research an area, how they would build their research question and how they would build their responses. So methodologies, and to understand the methodologies of lawyers would be a very important thing for an interdisciplinary research, an interdisciplinary master's student to engage in. In a sense, that's perhaps almost in a way easier to teach, or certainly I think more rewarding to teach than to basically say, hey, look, here's an enormous amount of legal material, you've got to learn that, and then we're going to test you on it later on, because of course those sorts of things change. What you need to know is why it matters and how it matters. And so methodologically, I've been focusing on saying, well, look, there's the descriptive technical element. Yes, that's important. You do need to understand that. But more than that, what I think anyone who steps into this sphere really needs is a toolkit to understand normative questions about the hierarchy and function of norms. How do legal systems interact with each other? Is there some sort of determinism that basically says the national trumps the international, or the international trumps the national, or is there a dynamic iteration between them? And to a certain extent, classical legal methods will provide you with answers to that, depending upon, for example, whether you focus on it on international law or whether you focus on national law, and depending on what's contained in specific constitutions. But it's more that the question is there, the question of how the norms interact, who decides how norms interact, what types of institutions. Are these political questions? Are these constitutional questions? Are these questions which it's suitable to give to judges to determine the answers to? And in that context, you know, what types of popular recourse might there be to changing the rules? The second area where I think that lawyers, the legal methodologies are very important to study to help our interdisciplinary students go beyond the legal technical is to understand the challenges of comparison, of comparative law. Because not only do you have lots of systems, if you will, in a vertical hierarchy, but you also have a set of horizontal relationships. The European Union legal order, to my mind, is not a single composite legal order, but it's a plural legal order composed not just of the European Union legal order itself, but also of the 28 legal orders of the member states, and indeed, in certain respects, of associated states, where there is also transference when you have relationships with associated states or with other states where it's in close bilateral relationships, or in the context of close multilateral relationships, such as those within the WTO and also the United Nations. And one could go on and on and on. I'd be extremely superficial in this context. And I just want to note very briefly two terms, if you will, within methodological practices and studies. One is to assist us in comparing, say, the reception of European law in different places, or comparing phenomena such as citizenship, as I've been doing with my own CITSI project in different contexts. One has been a turn to theory, that is to have a strong substratum for study, a strong foundation for study, which is focused on particular perspectives on constitutionalism, for example, on what constitutes the basic building blocks of a constitutionalist state. What are those? Are there certain basics of liberal constitutionalism, or is it what we need to focus on, the rule of law, or where does citizenship have a role to play in that? And I ask those questions because someone in an earlier session said, look, there are some challenges between, on the one hand, a liberal vision of Europe, and on the other hand, an authoritarian vision of Europe. And in that context, what role does law play in that? And what role is played by the constitutional building blocks? And the turn to theory within comparative law is an important part of that. And then finally, the turn to culture, if you will, the turn to ethnographic methods, to put law in its social context, as well as to study law's normative force. I mentioned the importance of working around and working with an understanding of form and function and hierarchy of norms. But there's also a turn to culture within comparative law, and that's another extremely important dimension that raises interdisciplinary challenges. Comparative lawyers increasingly also use the methods of social science, both qualitative and quantitative methods, to underpin their study of legal norms and to create bases for comparison of different legal systems. And there too is an area where we can help our interdisciplinary students to develop their competencies. So really it's a series of questions rather than any answers at this stage. Thank you very much.
Having been in Edinburgh, I had an opportunity to see these students, and many who did come from humanities backgrounds then trained in the methodology that Joe was talking about. It was quite impressive. And also Chris's comments about having the globalization and ethics institute to allow that kind of transdisciplinary interaction. Because I think that we have a campus here, but it's not fully functioning like one. And I think there does need to be more interaction among these, from the various faculties and so on. And I think a European Studies program, if conceptualized quite well, would serve that function. And now, for the final word and for discussion, we turn to a philosopher, Nenad Miščević, who works in Central European University in Budapest, but also here in Rijeka. So, some thoughts.
Does it? Oh yeah, it's working. Okay, I apologize a lot because my topic is not directly European studies. But that's the bad news. The good news is that I have to be sure. It won't hurt. What I wanted to talk just a little bit about is coming from my personal memories. But I think it might have a bit of relevance. And this is the following thing, that we are talking about European cooperation. We heard this nice stuff about cooperation with Northern Africa. I was trying desperately to get something with Tunisia, and it didn't work. It was very, very, very difficult. It's very nice. It's the best of the best, but there is an interesting problem that concerns the region and cooperation within the region. So I want to just remind you of what happened. I want to tell it from the perspective from here, from the regional perspective, and then you might react to it in different ways, which is that after the downfall of whatever it was, real socialism, communism, whatever you call it, there was a strong tendency to sort of think of Central Eastern. Nobody wanted to be Eastern Europe, so Eastern Europe was called Central Europe, and then Eastern Europe would probably be China and Japan. So we were Russia was Central Europe, but anyway. So the Central European University had Russia as a very important area. So, okay. I kept asking where was Eastern Europe, no answers. What's the region? Let's think of former, what was it, not Yugoslavia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, these sorts of things, and then you go a bit towards the east, etc. And there was a very strong institutional support that came from various sources, very strong institutional support for bringing the region together. We overdid it in Yugoslavia, so we brought it together in massacres. Others had more luck. But then after the massacres, again there was a whole lot of money, a whole lot of goodwill, a whole lot of institutional framework where people from these countries were brought together. I was at that time doing political summer schools for students from all kinds of problematic countries and some non-problematic, so like from Slovenia to Turkey. We group from each of the countries, the kids, the students, and then we would have I think the basic result, the basic positive result was a whole lot of relationships between couples. The couples formed from completely. What we need. That was the international, intercultural cooperation. It was very, very positive. It really gave some hope. And then, of course, there was Soros. So, and there was the Central European University, for example. The interesting thing, I think, that happened in the last 10 to 15 years was that all this is disappearing. What happened was that various so-called Central European countries entered the Union at various speed. So the lucky ones that were either advanced or served important strategic interests like Romania and stuff, they got immediately. Then my second country, so to speak, Slovenia, got in. Baltic states came in because we had this fight with Russia and whatever it was. And then my real country, Croatia, came in. Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, if you count it as a country. I don't know, because there were these drones with Great Albania, and then Kosovo would not count as being independent countries. Independence would be taken away by Tirana. Anyway, so yeah, bad luck. So these countries are not in. And there is no single institutional network that would take care of this area as such. So, you know what people do, they read Machiavelli, and they read Schelling. There's a wrong Schelling and right Schelling. In this case, the right Schelling is the game theory. And people behave rationally, which means it's much more rational for us here to go and cooperate directly with centers in Western Europe. Each of the countries that's in is using the fact that they are in to get to the center. The countries that are going to come in, they are inviting Putin to see how nice armies they have. Yeah, it's a matter of taste. But they would like to get to the centers. It's in their rational interest, of course, to jump over our heads, the same way as it is in our rational interest. It's in the interest of Croatia to jump over the head of Slovenia, and so on. Sorry?
And vice versa.
And vice versa. No, not vice versa, because we are to the east. So you just go to the west, to the center. No, it would be nice if it were vice versa. And the result is that this whole story about Central Europe, bringing Central Europe to Europe, to where it always belonged historically, etc., etc., if it were not for Turks and for Russians and for Tatars, there would always be it would actually be Germany and France. After all these dreams, we ended up with practically no institutional framework. Soros not interested in Tajikistan and these sorts of countries. We are not Tajiks, so we have bad luck. There is no institutional framework specific for Central and Eastern European cooperation. This is showing in the academic cooperation. This is showing in the results. The institutions that have been created for this are now being, by circumstances, etc., they are being pushed into other, how do you call it, reference functions. And that's it. And this is a kind of question that I sort of thought might be relevant for this center, if it wants to keep being center for advanced studies. Thanks.